So why, right? We already have good ways of building web apps. There's Ruby on Rails, Django on Python, Zope also on Python, Catalyst on Perl. Does the world need another web app building system? And so the short, easy answer is yes, because Haskell is just my favorite language and it's better. So why should anybody use Ruby, right? Because it's actually pretty good. I mean, quicksort in a lot of languages is like a page long, and in Ruby, which many people consider like the most elegant language in common use, it's pretty short, pretty concise, pretty readable. But something about quicksort in Haskell is even nicer, I feel. And there are a lot of things in Haskell that are just nice. And I'm just going to say short and concise is good and nice, and not kind of babble on about what all these good properties of Haskell are. And this is actually kind of a cheat. It turns out that this isn't really quicksort, and it won't work on billion element lists like the Ruby one might. I don't know, the Ruby one might not either. But anyway, the point is, in general, Haskell is a lovely language, and I love it, and that's the beginning of the answer of why.
Here's my Rails rant, but I guess there's not any hardcore Rails people in here, so that's good.
We should have invited those LA Ruby.
I actually thought about it, but we were too shy because we just worked on the speech today, so we thought it might be really bad, and they would just crush us.
Yeah, well, so basically, now I'm going to pick on Rails. So, Happstack is better than Rails. Okay, the model aspect of Rails, because in Rails you got the model, view, controller, paradigm, if you will. In Rails, you have this thing called object relational impedance mismatch.
Actually, in all of them. Python, Django, all these things
yeah,
have this
anything
problem.
that uses an object relational mapper will run into object relational impedance mismatch.
No Zope though.
What's that?
Really?
Zope is an object database. So it's similar to this kind of. Yeah, so we have this, which means sometimes you run into weird stuff because an ORM maps something into for instance, it'll map a field in the SQL database into a Ruby object, and then the person using that Ruby object might make naive assumptions about that object because it's not really an object, it's more like a semblance of what's in the database. And so you run into these weird problems with that where it just doesn't gel the way you want it to. So there's no perfect ORM. In Happstack, there's no object relational mapper needed. You have native data types via MASID. And that's what I was explaining earlier. You have all your data types in memory, accessible, and you don't have to do any weird stuff to retrieve them. Error-prone database migration strategy. Okay, so in Rails, you have what's called migrations, and that allows you to,
Add a field.
You build a blog, and you have, a few fields. Let's say you have title, body, and author, let's say. And then one day you realize, oh, I need to add a field called date, because I need the date. And so you have to modify the database. Well, you're already running this in production, and well, this migration is this way to handle, okay, I'm going to push this out to production, and now I'm going to convert what's running out there to use the new database structure. But what happens is that you got to be very, very careful because sometimes you don't really know what this SQL statement is going to do to the production database because your development database might be slightly different, and you just can't foresee everything that might potentially happen. So it's, you just either got to have an SQL god or, you got to be very, very careful. On Happstack, on the other hand, crossing fingers here, you have type-safe migration strategy via MASID. In other words, it's not going to even compile, it's not going to accept it, it's not going to try to convert any data if there's if it doesn't match, it's just going to throw it out. And your app may not be running, but at least it's not going to mess with your data. Okay, in Rails, yeah, like I was explaining earlier, you have database queries that scale pretty good. But again, you run into these performance problems eventually, scalability issues. In Happstack, you got in-memory map lookups that scale awesomely. So we got good, awesome. This intensifier is more intense. Next slide. Okay, view. So Happstack is better than Rails, view aspect. In Rails, you got the ERB default templating system, and Simon, I know you're probably going to say, well, that's not the only templating system in Rails.
Actually, I don't know well enough to say that, so
Okay, cool.
no trouble here.
All right, cool. So it allows mixing presentation and business logic, which is kind of like the age-old debate between, okay, HTML and CSS, put your presentation in your CSS, not your HTML. It allows you to mix that all into one big pot. Happstack, on the other hand, enforces separation of controller view better than Rails does, because it says, I'm just going to take this constant value, and that's all I'm going to take. And you can go screw yourself if you try to do logic in here. Another aspect, ERB does not prevent malformed XML outputs. If you use something like HSP with Happstack, it guarantees well-formed XML. So it'll literally tell you, hey, this isn't well-formed, or it'll fix it for you. So that's pretty nice. That's a nice thing. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Controller. Happstack is better than Rails in this aspect too. In Rails, you kind of have this paradigm of lots and lots of code generation. You can build a controller, if you will, which might be for blog posts or might be for adding recipes for your cookbook app. I don't know.